with nicknames like the American Fabius, the father of his country, and the devourer of villages. A symbol for liberation, as the only leader to successfully revolt against a colonial empire. By age 11, he had completed his schooling and was willed his first 10 enslaved people. By age 22, he had started a world war. He was the only president to have a state named after him, while also being the only president who never got to live in the White House. He married one of the richest women in Virginia, and then picked a fight with a king. He was impossible to kill, surviving diphtheria, tuberculosis, smallpox, malaria, dysentery, quinsy, carbuncle, pneumonia, and a near drowning in an icy clogged river. In one battle alone, he had 2 horses shot out from under him and 4 bullets passed close enough to pierce his clothing. He was a man's man, first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his compatriots. He was a warrior poet for all his life, but the greatest act of his life, the one that gave him his greatest fame, was his resignation as Commander-in-Chief of America. No one on earth had done such a thing. He never wanted to be president. He could have been king. Today, George Washington remains the only president ever to be referred to as godlike. John Washington, a merchant in 1656, sailed as second mate to the colony of Virginia. 1 year later, in 1657, on the return trip, his ship fully laden with tobacco ran aground in the Potomac River. When the ship was repaired and set sail, John elected to stay for the remaining 20 years of his life. 76 years after John landed in the Americas, George Washington was born in 1732 at Pope's Creek, in the British colony of Virginia. 11 years later, Washington's father died, and he was pulled from formal schooling, never to return. He inherited the family farm and slaves. His older half-brother Lawrence inherited what we now call Mount Vernon. Later, Washington would fully own Vernon too. Embarrassed by his poor schooling, Washington was encouraged on by his widowed mother. He carried the weighty burdens of running a farm throughout his adolescence. George was also talented in the fields of mathematics, trigonometry, and most importantly, land surveying. What young Washington lacked in inherited wealth, position, or aristocratic polish, he made up for in determination and family connections that set him on the road to fame and fortune. By 1749, Washington was named surveyor of Culpeper County, Virginia, at the age of 17, earning £50 sterling per annum. 4 years of surveying equipped young Washington with cheat code-like abilities in the age of the frontier. Becoming a talented mapmaker, he realized the frontier's immensity and how to survive within it. Most importantly, he could identify vast tracts of land and tell you the advantages and disadvantages of it, what you could do with it, what you could grow or hunt on it, who you might find living within it, and how much it costs. He went into the wilderness as a dull young pup. 4 years later, he emerged as a shop and tool. This was his higher education, his Oxford. In 1752, at age 22, Washington bought his single biggest land purchase to date. 1,500 acres of complete wilderness on Bullskin Creek in Frederick County, Virginia. Indeed, most of older Washington's economic success was underpinned by his skills at identifying land values. But the expression, land rich, cash poor, applied to Washington for most of his life. Later that year, inspired by his half-brother's military career, young Washington sought and was appointed a commission as a major and commander of one of the militia districts. 1 year later, in the Battle of the Ohio Valley, young Washington and his men were sent on a mission. March down to the valley, negotiate peace with the Iroquois Confederacy, gather further intelligence about the French forces, and get back before winter. A daunting task to say the least. His men and him completed the mission in 77 days, meeting both parties and acquiring adequate intelligence. Washington's star had begun to shimmer. At age 24, Washington was promoted to lieutenant colonel and second in command of the 300-strong Virginia Regiment, with orders to confront French forces at the forks of the Ohio. And confront he did. This event sparked the French and Indian War, which later became part of the larger 7 Years' War. Afterward, Washington was promoted to command of the regiment and colonel upon the regimental commander's death. 2 months later, a 900-man French force attacked the British fort Washington and his men occupied. On July 4, 1754, Washington and his troops surrendered and abandoned the fort. Upon the return to Virginia, Washington, expecting to be rebuked by his superiors, was instead received with a vote of confidence. They blamed the defeat on poor supply lines and the refusal of aid by the other colonies. Shortly after, Washington resigned his commission over a dispute of command with an outranking officer. In 2 short years, Washington had tasted the victory of battle, as well as the defeat. But his battle thirst was not quite quenched. In 1755, Washington served voluntarily as an aide to General Edward Braddock, who led a British expedition to expel the French from Fort Duquesne and the Ohio country. Because Braddock insisted on fighting as gentlemen, they were confronted and a bloodbath ensued. 2/3 of the expedition were killed, including Braddock himself, by French Canadians and Native Americans. During the battle, Washington, very ill with dysentery, rallied the survivors and formed a rear guard, allowing the remnants of the force to disengage and retreat. Washington's actions, under fire, silenced his critics from a year before. Washington engaged in the art of war, alongside the Virginia Regiment, sometimes under his command, sometimes not, until the end of the war. Washington resigned a veteran. For nearly 4 years, he had attacked and defended a 300-mile-long portion of the frontier. He had also become older, wiser, and a superior leader. His military experience gave him confidence, and his knowledge of British military tactics would only become more and more valuable over time. It is also at this time that Washington began to recognize destructive competition among colonial bureaucracies, which later affected his opinion on a central governing body. During Washington's tenure, he swelled the ranks of his regiment from 300 to 1,000 men, increased their competence, and one could argue Virginia's frontier population suffered less than other colonies because of him. At age 26, Washington married Martha Dandridge Custis, the 27-year-old widow of a wealthy plantation owner. Included in the marriage were 16,000 acres of land and 84 slaves. Washington had become one of the wealthiest men in Virginia overnight. By the time he died, Washington had more than 52,000 acres, sprinkled from New York in the north, through Pennsylvania and Maryland, to Virginia in the south, and Kentucky, and the Ohio Valley in the west, something above 81 square miles. For almost the next 20 years, until the eve of the Revolution, Washington devoted himself to the duties and pleasures of a great landholder and a great husband. He even found time for social and political interests on the side. For 6 days a week, he rose early and worked hard, entertained company, wrote letters, made purchases and sales, and went fox hunting. He had his own water-powered flour mill, blacksmith, brick and charcoal kilns, carpenters, and masons. He built a fishery. He had coopers, weavers, and his own shoemaker. He turned out barrels, linen, cotton, and woolen goods. Washington's politics were simple. He wanted out from under the hand of colonial tyranny. He also didn't like taxes. At 42, George Washington found himself in a tavern in Raleigh, with a group of his peers calling for a Continental Congress. He made a speech that was much praised for its pithy eloquence, declaring, "I will raise 1,000 men, subsist them at my own expense, and march myself at their head for the relief of Boston." Boston was at war. The American Revolution had begun in 1775, with the battles of Lexington and Concord and the siege of Boston. Washington left Mount Vernon and would not return for 6 years. Everyone expected Washington to be the general of the Virginian Army, when he was unanimously elected to be the general for the entire Continental Army. Even Washington himself was surprised, as he used some of his influence to avoid this exact appointment. Nevertheless, at 43, Washington was going to war on a world stage as a massive underdog, outmanned, undersupplied, and outgunned. First things first, he went to Boston and helped defend the evacuation of the city. He then traveled to defend an upcoming attack on New York. He was defeated and retreated to Manhattan Island. Washington made another stand in Manhattan, defeated again, and had to retreat to New Jersey. 2 years in, Washington had a string of defeats to his name and was feeling public pressure to perform or be replaced. He was getting outmaneuvered and needed to change his strategy. Washington had to catch the British off guard, and that's exactly what he did. His first 2 victories came in surprise succession, the battles of Trenton and Princeton. Both involved surprise attacks by crossing the Delaware River under cover of darkness. He then lost 2 more battles, the Battle of Brandywine and the Battle of Germantown. Finally, a turning point in the war, the Battle of Saratoga, a decisive American victory. Enter Benjamin Franklin. He took advantage of America's victory to form an alliance with France. A genius move by historical standards. Once America was allied and proved she could win battles, Washington's strategy was simple: draw out the war, never commit, fight another day, and spill as much British blood as possible, all while disrupting their supply lines. By 1779, Washington reached legendary status, refusing to be extinguished. 5 years into the Revolutionary War, he had the ability to appoint the right man for the right job. He ran his army on merit. His political savvy gave him the ability to deal with Continental Congress. He was always an excellent negotiator, solving one of the largest issues of the war, supplying an army. His greatest ability, the ability to inspire and motivate, was something you couldn't teach. It's what made him a legend. And preserving the unity of the army is what made him a leader. The final decisive stroke of the war, the capture of Cornwallis at Yorktown, is to be credited chiefly to Washington's vision. Later, he brought the army back into New York as the British peacefully evacuated the rest of the colonies. Washington disbanded the army and resigned at age 51, showing a skeptical world a new republic, without leader or army. Washington, now battle-hardened from 8 years of war, waived his nearly decade's worth of salary and went home. From the second he resigned command and left for Mount Vernon, the United States fell into disorder. There were many arguments, most stemmed from fighting a massive war with borrowed money. For nearly 4 years, Washington attended to his interests, entertained guests, statesmen, and other diplomats. He was becoming upset a federal government had yet to be formed so long after the war had finished. He sent many letters to the leading men of the country, urging them to get this done, or the result would be anarchy. Washington was 55 when he was elected again to represent Virginia at a gathering of all the states in Philadelphia. Hesitant about attending, partly because he felt tired and old, partly because of doubts about the outcome, there was still much disagreement between states. On arrival to the Constitutional Convention, he was immediately chosen as president for the meeting. For 4 months he presided over the convention, rarely speaking. While outside of the hall, Washington was the loudest voice for stern measures. His weight of character did more than any other single force to bring the convention to an agreement and obtain ratification. He alone commanded the respect of both parties, and he alone would be able to give prestige to the Republic throughout Europe. In no state was any other name considered. A unanimous vote for Washington at age 57, and reluctantly, for his love of peace, his distrust of his own abilities, and his fear that his motives in advocating the new government might be misconstrued, all made him unwilling. He accepted. President Washington's administration of the government in the next 4 years was marked by the caution, the methodical precision, and the sober judgment that had always distinguished him. At age 61, He had planned to resign after his first term, but the political strife in the nation convinced him he should remain in office. Washington stayed distant from partisan arguments, never taking sides, but always open to opinions. When two of his best cabinet ministers clashed and tried to resign, he simply refused their resignations. The two offending parties were Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. The United States was fully expected to fail. It actually had no chance, with all of its enemies and internal battles. Everyone understood that the nation had survived its storms of infancy solely because of the personal strength, integrity, wisdom, and frankly, paternal leadership of the president. George Washington, as an old man, rode a wild bull in a rodeo before the entire world for 8 years, not 8 seconds, to prove that an elected government under a written constitution could actually govern the erratic passions of the masses. On every possible occasion, Washington said to his fellow Americans that, while their individual states might be their homes, the United States of America was their nation. King George and George Washington never met. Neither ever set foot in the other's homeland. One was born to rule, while the other was a reluctant leader. In some ways, the gaps that set them apart were as wide as the ocean between them. Yet their lives were inextricably linked through war. And in the end, perhaps they understood each other as only those who have worn the mantle of leadership truly can. On hearing that Washington would resign his presidency and retire from power, the King of Great Britain named George Washington, his enemy from just a decade ago, the greatest man in the world. At the age of 65, Washington finally got to retire to Mount Vernon, turning down an offered third term. He died 2 years later, at the age of 67. It really cannot be expressed on how much George Washington was so enormously admired in his day, not just in America, but across Europe. Why he was called, in all sincerity, the father of his country, is because he actually was. Without him, there wouldn't be a United States of America.